October 8th, 1943. 24,000 feet over Bremen, Germany. The world is a cacophony of absolute violence. The shudder of 4 straining Wright Cyclone engines, the percussive thump, thump, thump of 50 caliber machine guns, the terrifying metallic spang of flak shards ripping through aluminum skin. Inside the belly of the B-17F, snap, crackle, pop, the air is thick with the smell of cordite, fear, and cold sweat. Down here, in the plexiglass and steel sphere known as the ball turret, Staff Sergeant Maynard Snuffy Smith is completely alone. He is the bomber's dangling, vulnerable eye. Suspended in a fetal position, knees near his ears, he is the turret. His world is a 360-degree view of hell. Sky streaked with contrails and tracer fire, the dark, ugly blossoms of anti-aircraft explosions, the shapes of other fortresses, some flying steady, some trailing fire, some beginning their terrible, final fall. His hands, numb inside thick gloves, grip the firing controls. His breath fogs the glass. He's scanning, always scanning, for the blur of a Focke-Wulf 190 diving from the sun, for the head-on slash of a Messerschmitt. The ball turret is the most isolated position on the aircraft. To be hit here is to be entombed. The hydraulic system that rotates his tiny world also seals his fate. If it fails, he's locked in, a frozen coffin at 24,000 feet. Then, the bomber lurches, not from flak, but from something deeper, more systemic. A sound like a sledgehammer hitting a tin roof reverberates through the fuselage. The hydraulic lines snaking into his turret shudder and go limp. In an instant, Smith's universe stops spinning. The turret locks in place, his field of view fixed on a patch of empty sky. The gentle whir of the hydraulic motor is replaced by a dead, chilling silence. He's trapped. But that's not the worst of it. Through the interphone, crackling with strained voices, the pilot's call cuts through. Hydraulics are hit. I've got no pressure. Landing gear won't respond. Repeat, gear is stuck up. The mission isn't over when the bombs drop. The mission is over when you land. And snap, crackle, pop now has no way to land. It will have to belly slide onto the runway. A shower of sparks, ruptured fuel lines, and almost certain fire. For the 10 men aboard, the flak over Bremen was just the opening act. The main tragedy is waiting for them back home on a friendly field. Smith, locked in his glass ball, hears the panic, feels it in the strained silence that follows the pilot's report. He's a gunner, not a mechanic, but he remembers something. A memory surfaces, not from gunnery school, but from his days hanging around the airfield mechanics in England. A story, a trick shared over a cigarette, a last-ditch, desperate fix for a jammed landing gear. It involved bypassing the entire hydraulic system. It involved a manual release cable, a specific bolt, and a baseball. Could it work? Did he remember it right? And even if he did, to try it, he'd have to get out of this turret first. A turret currently locked shut, with him inside. The escape procedure for a functioning ball turret was claustrophobic enough. You had to rotate the sphere until the guns pointed straight down, aligning a narrow hatch with a hole in the fuselage floor. Then you'd contort yourself backwards, hoping you didn't kick your parachute loose, and haul your body up into the relative safety of the bomber's belly. Smith's turret was not functioning. It was a dead, frozen pod. "I'm jammed in here." His voice, tight over the interphone, cut through the post-target run chatter. "Turret's locked. I can't rotate." The crew's dilemma was horrific. A man trapped in the most vulnerable part of a crippled aircraft, and that aircraft itself dying, bleeding hydraulic fluid from a dozen wounds. To attempt a crash landing with the turret locked and Smith inside was a death sentence for him. The first impact with the ground would shatter the plexiglass sphere into a million shards. Up in the radio room, the crew chief was already thinking with his hands, trying to manually pump the hydraulic system. No response. The lines were severed. The fluid was gone, streaming into the slipstream over occupied Europe. Inside his glass prison, Smith fought the first cold tendrils of panic. He could see the white contrails of the formation leaving them behind. Snap, crackle, pop was losing speed, lagging, a wounded bird. The freezing air whistled through flak holes. He forced himself to breathe, to think. The mechanics, the image came to him not as a manual, but as a scene. A grease-stained sergeant back at Bassingbourn, squatting by a B-17's wheel well, spinning a tail. See this cable, kid? That's the manual release. If the hydraulics go, you pull this T-handle, the gear unlocks, and gravity does the rest. But if the housing's bent or the cable's jammed, the mechanic had grinned, a piece of straw in his teeth, well, then you gotta get creative. You find a bolt, a good solid bolt. You use it to link the cable to the lever arm. Like a baseball stitch. You're just connecting the muscle to the bone. A baseball stitch. A connection. A jury rig. I need a wrench in a bolt, Smith barked into the interphone. I think I can manually release the gear. The statement was met with a heartbeat of stunned silence, then action. The waist gunner, crawling forward past the flickering shadows of severed cables, passed tools down through the fuselage to the radio operator, who then had to somehow get them to a man locked in a bubble below the floor. Meanwhile, Smith had to free himself. His only hope was the manual crank, a small, unassuming handle meant for emergencies. He grabbed it, his gloves slipping on the cold metal. He began to turn. It was like trying to rotate a bank vault by hand. Every inch was a battle against seized gears and frozen bearings. Sweat pooled under his flight suit, freezing at his temples. The muscles in his arms and back screamed. But slowly, with a grating shriek of protest, the world outside his window began to move. He cranked until the hatch aligned. He popped the latch, and with a desperate backward wriggle, he spilled out onto the cold metal deck of the bomb bay. He was free of the coffin. Now he had to save the ship. But as he looked up into the tangled jungle of cables, conduits, and darkened hydraulic lines in the wheel well, the mechanic's casual story collided with brutal reality. Could he even find the right cable? And if he did, what if the German flak had turned the release mechanism into a twisted knot of useless metal? The bomb bay of a wounded B-17 is no place for the faint of heart. It's a cavern of noise and rushing wind, the skeletal beams of the fuselage vibrating like tuning forks. Smith crouched in that space, the 200-mile-per-hour gale tearing at his clothes, his mind a singular beam of focus. Above him, the massive dark shapes of the two undeployed landing gear loomed, tucked up in their wells like metal knees. The mechanic's voice was his guide. Find the manual release cable. His eyes scanned the intricate web of lines. There, a braided steel cable, about the thickness of his finger, running from a lever mechanism down to a pulley. It was the aircraft's tendon, the direct physical link to the landing gear locks. He followed it with a gloved hand. The housing was dented, shrapnel. The cable was taut, jammed in its sleeve. The plan was simple in theory. Disconnect the jammed cable from the lever and reconnect it with something rigid that could transmit force. A solid bolt would act as a makeshift rod, a short, strong bridge. "Bolt!" he yelled again, his voice swallowed by the engine roar. A hand from the radio room reached down, passing not just a bolt, but a wrench in a pair of pliers. The tools were ice cold. Smith's fingers, already stiff, fumbled. He had to work by feel as much as sight. Using the wrench, he fought to loosen the clevis pin that held the cable end to the lever mechanism. The metal screamed in protest, frozen by altitude and cold. Every second felt like an hour. The English Channel was somewhere below them, a gray expanse. Their fuel was bleeding away, both from the tanks and from the strain of flying with a compromised aerodynamics. Come on, come on! With a final grating turn, the pin came free. The cable end swung loose. Now the bolt. It was a standard piece of hardware, maybe 3 inches long. He fed it through the eye of the lever arm. Then, with a Herculean effort, he pulled the seized cable up and looped its end around the bolt's threads. There was no time for elegance. This wasn't engineering. It was battlefield surgery.
He used the pliers to crimp the cable loop as tight as he could around the bolt, a brutal, permanent knot. He was creating a single, rigid link, the baseball stitch. The bolt was now the only connection between the pilot's will and 4,000 pounds of landing gear. He took a breath, the air thin and biting. The pilot's voice came over the interphone, calm but urgent. "Smith, what's your status? We're approaching the coast. We need to try this soon or we commit to a belly landing." Smith looked at his handiwork. It was crude, ugly, a hack. It had to hold long enough for one pull, one transmission of force. "It's rigged," he shouted back. "On your command." The pilot's order was simple. Release the gear. Smith wrapped both hands around the cold steel of the T-handle connected to his jury-rigged mechanism. This was the moment. If the bolt held, the gear should unlock and fall into place by its own weight. If the mechanism was too badly damaged, or if his connection failed, nothing would happen, and they would know their fate was a fiery slide. He took one last look at the bolt, a small, dull piece of metal against the vast complexity of the wounded bomber. Then he pulled. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The T-handle in Smith's hands meant resistance, then gave with a terrible metallic crack that echoed through the wheel well. It wasn't the sound of failure, it was the sound of something shearing, something releasing. Above him, in the left landing gear well, there was a shudder, a deep mechanical groan. Then, with a sudden, violent rush of wind and noise, the massive left main gear broke free of its locks. It didn't lower gracefully, it fell. It slammed downward, driven by gravity in its own immense weight, crashing into position with a jarring thud that shook the entire airframe. The left wing dipped momentarily under the sudden drag. A cheer started to erupt over the interphone, but it was cut short. The right gear hadn't moved. Smith's heart plummeted. One wheel down was worse than none. Landing with one gear up and one down meant a guaranteed ground loop, a violent cartwheel that would tear the bomber apart. They were still doomed. "The right gear is stuck," the pilot confirmed, his voice strained. "We need it down, Smith, now." The wind in the bomb bay was a hurricane now, the deployed left gear acting like a giant air brake. Smith, drenched in cold sweat, turned to the right side mechanism. The flak damage here was worse. The housing was a mangled bird's nest of torn metal. The manual release cable was visibly kinked, pinched in its crushed sleeve. There was no time for finesse, no time for another delicate bolt and stitch operation. He had one tool left, brute force. He braced himself against a fuselage beam, grabbed the kinked cable with his pliers, and pulled. He pulled with everything he had, with the strength of a man pulling his own life from a cliff's edge. The cable bit into his gloves. His muscles burned. He screamed against the wind, a raw, guttural sound lost in the roar. With a sound like a rifle shot, the pinched cable tore free from its housing. Simultaneously, up in the well, the right gear lock shattered. This time, the gear didn't just fall, it exploded downward. The violent release was so extreme that the landing gear strut overextended, slamming into place and then bouncing, causing the entire B-17 to lurch like a spooked horse. "Gear is down! Both gear are down!" the pilot yelled. The relief was palpable, a collective gasp over the channel. They had a chance. But the drama wasn't over. Snap, Crackle, Pop was a mortally wounded giant. As it descended toward the emergency field at RAF Falmere, the pilot fought the controls. The hydraulics for the flaps were gone too. They would land fast, too fast, and without brakes. The wheels touched English soil with a shriek of rubber. The bomber, far over landing speed, raced down the runway. It veered, the asymmetrical drag from battle damage pulling it toward the edge. The tires smoked, then burst. The metal wheel rims dug into the tarmac, sending up a shower of sparks.
From his position in the belly, Smith saw the world become a blur of vibration and noise, and then he saw the first flickering tongue of flame in the left wheel well. The ruptured hydraulic lines, the friction, the heat, it had all ignited. The B-17 ground to a violent, shuddering halt, half on, half off the runway. The order came immediately. Abandon! Fire! Everybody out! Smith didn't remember climbing out. He tumbled from the bomb bay door onto the hard, blessedly solid ground. He ran, stumbling, putting distance between himself and the fuel-laden wings. He turned to look just as the first fire truck arrived, its bell clanging. Snap, crackle, pop, the bomber that had brought them home was now a pillar of black smoke and hungry flame. They had cheated the flak over Bremen. They had cheated a crash landing. But the final, ferocious price of their mission was being paid in fire on a friendly field. Smith stood there, his ears ringing, the heat of the blaze on his face. He was alive. They all were. And in his pocket, his fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the wrench he'd forgotten to let go of.